Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, despite our many differences, the so-called Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share many things in common. One thing is that we worship the same God, and that God can never be made into a graven image, to quote the Ten Commandments. It is a reminder to all of us that God cannot be defined by anything that human beings make. And of course, that's a good thing. It keeps us humble in realizing that God is not something that we can get a handle on, or someone that we can manipulate to our own ends. But it also creates some challenges, because we human beings so desperately want to be able to see, to hear, to touch, to smell God. We want something tangible to hang on to. I remember during a conversation with one of my seminary classmates, I was asked the question, what is God? And I realized in that moment that that question isn't really easy to answer. God is by definition unique, unlike anything else. You can use the old familiar descriptors, omnipotent, omniscient, creator of all things, but those things only refer to God. So they don't really mean a whole lot other than that's what God is. It doesn't tell us really anything about God. It doesn't help us define what the word God means. And we could say that God is a loving father or a loving mother, but we realize that that language is an analogy. It tells us what God is like, but not what God is. So it can be hard for us, because God can feel so very distant sometimes. God can be hard to visualize or feel God's presence. What are we to do when we feel like God is far away, or even wonder if God is there at all? Now, our first reading from 2 Kings is from the Hebrew Bible. Scholars have long noticed that the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings have a special relationship to one another. Together they tell a relatively unified story about a people and their relationship with God. But it's a story that ends badly with the destruction of Israel and then later the destruction of Judah. These books seem to have been written to explain why these catastrophic things happened. The writers argue in their narrative that these tragedies occurred because the people, especially the rulers, had turned away from God. But today's reading comes before all of that destruction. The context is a great famine that has just come to an end. The man from Baal Shalishah is celebrating his great harvest by bringing his offering of first fruits to the prophet Elisha. And you have no idea how many times I had to practice saying that to get it right. And the reader this morning at St. John, she did just fine. She did just as well as that. I'm like, gosh, why did I bother practicing that many times? But he brought 20 loaves and fresh ears of grain. Elisha instructs his servant to give the offering to the people so that they may eat their fill. But the servant objects. There isn't enough food to feed the people, he says. That should sound oddly familiar. But the prophet pronounces a message from God that the people will eat their fill and there will still be food left over. And that's exactly what happened. Here we see concern for those in need. We see God's special care for those at the fringes of society. A reminder that food in and of itself is important. And I know it might sound strange to say that, but in our day and age, there are some Christians who argue that God only cares about spiritual things. God doesn't care about material things like food. Now, the reading from Ephesians consists of the second part of a prayer by the author. The first half of the prayer starts back in Ephesians 3:1. In this part of the prayer, the writer acknowledges God the Father. And just as the stars have names from God, so does every family. Then the prayer contains a set of petitions, things asked of God. These 5 requests are asked on behalf of the apostles' readers. Notice in these readings how home is an important concept in this message. The apostle is praying that God will make a home in the hearts of the believers. The apostle is praying that together the believers themselves would be a family, a home for all of them. Now, for our gospel reading, we jumped from the Gospel of Mark, which was the first one written down, to the Gospel of John, the last one written down. And for the next 5 Sundays, we will be reading from John. This gospel has a very different feel, a different set of concerns from Mark. The Gospel of Mark has a sense of urgency. The writer uses the word immediately at least 35 times, and Mark is the shortest gospel. Whereas the Gospel of John is a slower pace, not as much action, with long speeches. And in fact, I was thinking about this back when I was in seminary. A movie came out on the Gospel of John. Perhaps some of you saw it. But some of my classmates went and saw it. And I was curious, because of the structure of the book of John, how do you make a movie out of that? There's not a lot of action and a bunch of long speeches. So I was curious how that worked. And I asked him, well, what was it like? And he says, well, it was a movie with very little action and lots of long speeches. I was like, okay, that seems about right. But one feature that really comes into play in the 4th gospel is its concern for signs. Signs are objects or actions that point to something beyond themselves. Here we see the bread that Jesus provides the people points to the capital B bread, Jesus Christ himself. While the other Gospels, including our reading from 2 Kings, point to the needs of the people, here Jesus is focusing on giving a sign to the people. Unfortunately, as can often happen with signs, the people misunderstand the sign and decide to make him king. Now you can see how they would connect Jesus with the prophets of old. Because after all, they would have known the story of Elisha feeding the multitudes. And there's some key similarities between the 2 stories, so they immediately make that connection. But also, since the Gospel of John does not actually have a Last Supper, where Jesus institutes communion, this part of John, this passage actually kind of serves that capacity instead. Notice the verbs that are used. Jesus took the bread, Jesus gave thanks, and Jesus gave it to them. Well, those verbs we use in communion. And in case the connection isn't clear enough, the word for give thanks there is Eucharistē, which is the same word that gives us the word Eucharist, communion. So what does all this have to do with what I was saying earlier? What does this tell us about what is God? Well, one of those theologians that has greatly influenced my own thinking is Carter Hayward. Now, I sometimes jokingly refer to her as Aunt Carter, but she's no relation, and she spells Hayward the wrong way, with E-Y instead of A-Y. So not everybody's perfect. But in one of her books, she points out that God isn't a thing at all. God is, in fact, a verb. In other words, God is action, not a static thing. God is, in fact, God is loving others. God is working for justice. God is healing people. God is providing material needs for others. So when we look at today's texts, we see God throughout. We see the prophet Elisha miraculously feeding a multitude of people. That action is God. In Ephesians, we see the author praying for their readers. And through the actions of home and family, where we feel safe and secure, we see God at work. But most importantly for us Christians, in the actions of Jesus Christ, we definitively see God at work. God is the act of saving us from aimlessness and sin. Which reminds us of the story that Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, an ordained Presbyterian minister, used to say. When he was a child, he'd get so discouraged by all the darkness, by all the pain, by all the injustice in the world. And he'd ask his mother about it. But his mother told him to look to the helpers. Look for all those people who are helping out, who are doing good despite all of the darkness. Firefighters trying to control a fire to save lives. Donors giving money to be used to help others. Volunteers providing food and clothing. These seemingly little acts are God. The concept of God can seem so intangible, so hard to grasp. But if you look at it in a different way, it really isn't. We just need to start thinking about God as action rather than as a thing. The Bible reminds us that God is nearer to us than our own breathing. That's because God is present whenever the work of God's mission is present. When people are praying for others, when people are giving of their time, their talents, their treasures for others, when people are working to improve this world, when people are speaking words of love to others, God is there. God is never far away. So it is easy to get discouraged, especially when we think about, well, where's God? I can't see God, I can't hear God, I can't touch God. Where is God? But if you look around you, look for the helpers, to use Fred Rogers' term, you will see that God is everywhere. Whenever someone does an act of love and compassion. Amen.